This is Jim over at the Book Loft. I'm here talking to Abraham Reisman today about his new book. It's True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. I really enjoyed this book.
Thank you.
For a lot of reasons. I think it's important, for one thing. Like, I think this is an important narrative. I think it's not a story that's necessarily being told as widely as it should be, honestly. And it's interesting to me because I was recently watching a documentary. It was about 2000 AD, the comic book company, and Neil Gaiman. They were interviewing Neil Gaiman, who's got a blurb on the back of your book, actually. And he said kind of the thrust of 2000 AD, their titles were, you can't trust your heroes. That was a quote that he had. And I think that kind of applies, it applies kind of well to your book as well. I think there's to a degree, that's kind of an apt observation when it comes to Stan Lee. And it's also interesting because, a guy who came out of 2000 AD, I noticed there was kind of a conspicuous mention of Alan Moore in your book. And for me, I think like we probably had a similar experience growing up. There's this great picture in your book of you meeting Stan Lee as a boy. And, correct me if I'm wrong. Were you a comic book fan as a kid?
I was a comic book reader from late grade school. Well, early grade school, but I only really started reading Marvel until late in grade school. But prior to that, I'd been aware of Marvel thanks to the various Marvel cartoons that were on in the early 90s. But yeah, so I became acquainted with Marvel when I was a kid, yeah.
Right on, yeah. And I think that I had a very similar experience. But it was an interview that I watched for Alan Moore where he talked about if you've ever seen a picture of Jack Kirby, do you think he's the type of guy who would like to be called Jolly Jack? And that was kind of the first time I'd ever thought, well, maybe there's more to this than just the kind of happy-go-lucky, Stan the Man, Jolly Jack. I think that most of us as comic fans took that narrative for granted. Like, I don't think I can remember, and that's probably when I was in my late 20s watching that interview. Like, I never had any suspicion that anything was going on beyond what Marvel was letting us see. And do you agree with that?
What do you mean? That the narrative wasn't really out there?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, bits and pieces. Certainly Marvel has not presented a complete narrative of Stan that is accurate. It's not really in their interests to. There's a corporate narrative that was something that Stan came up with in some parts and others did in other parts, and it's proven to be a lucrative narrative for Marvel and now Disney, which has owned Marvel since 2009, to have. And it has, because the narrative says Stan Lee is the primary creative force behind all of these characters, or the core pantheon of characters for the most part, that narrative has allowed Marvel and Disney and Stan to specifically Marvel and Disney to sort of keep everything in-house and not have to worry about somebody who was a freelancer like Jack Kirby, or his estate, going against Marvel and later Disney's interests, because Stan was a good company man. Stan, for the most part, although there was a lawsuit from 2002 to 2005, it really didn't rock the boat with Marvel. And in 2005 settled, and then, never said a bad word about them again. So, Marvel wanted to have their properties be primarily associated with somebody who had a pretty good relationship with them. And, as I say in the book, I don't know who created the characters, and I don't think any of us will ever know because documentation was so shoddy from that period. And you just have the competing claims of Stan and Jack Kirby. But the certainty with which the narrative has been presented by Marvel over the decades, even when there was a revision in it where later it became that Stan was the co-creator of these characters after decades of them saying he was the creator, you know, that narrative was useful to Marvel and Disney. And, you know, I don't see them telling the sort of warts and all story anytime soon.
Yeah, it's very, like, it's fascinating to me. Because you talk about the spider gun. Could you talk a little bit about that? You know, there's supposedly a sketch out there that Jack Kirby did that showed Spider, like an original...
Oh, you mean the original Spider-Man pages?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the origins of Spider-Man, like the origins of all the characters from the 60s for the most part, are murky. Jack claimed that he had come up with the idea for Spider-Man as a riff
I
on
never heard that before.
Yeah, as a riff on some concepts that he and his former partner Joe Simon had kicked around years before. Yeah, that gets complicated because even if you buy Jack's version of that, then you get into the question of whether other people from that strain, that world, had contributed ideas to it. But be that as it may, Jack pretty incontrovertibly made a few pages of a Spider-Man story, of the first Spider-Man story. However, Steve Ditko, who ended up actually drawing those pages and co-writing them, you know, Steve Ditko ended up doing the pages. Jack did a first pass at a few of them, and those pages are currently unaccounted for and have never been printed. So there are people who've claimed that they've seen them, Steve Ditko being one of them. In one of his mail order pamphlet essays, he talked about how it was basically nothing like the Spider-Man that we eventually saw, visually and also in terms of the story. And Jim Shooter, the former editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, has also claimed to me and others that he has seen those pages, and that, again, they were radically different from the Spider-Man that we've come to know and love. And you mentioned the gun. Yeah, there was allegedly this version of Spider-Man had a web gun as opposed to web shooters in his wrists. So yeah, we don't, again, these are big question marks. Those pages are not, it's not known where they are or what they looked like in any kind of independently verifiable way. We just know the words of a couple of people who claim that they saw them.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, it's. I think that's what's one thing that's really compelling about the book is it is such a great mystery, and I think the way you present it. I mean, like maybe talking about it here, it sounds kind of esoteric, but in the book, I felt like, you know, it was almost like. I was in suspense, even as familiar as I was with the subject. And, you know, you talk about like that hardcore geekdom. It is something that I was aware of, like that kind of questionable provenance. But there was stuff in your book that I honestly had never heard before. And I thought it was kind of refreshing to see it put together in such, like, I mean, it's a very concise book. It's about what, 300 some pages,
something like that.
And I feel like, what's that?
I said something like that. Yeah.
Oh, something like that. Yeah. And I thought it was one of those. I don't think it's particularly unkind to Stanley. I feel like it treats him like a human being, and like, you know, there's maybe some moments where he comes out not looking very, very good, but, you know, based on things that he did and said. Let me ask you this. I've just got one more comic book question, and then I think I'll hand you over to Edison. He's got some more specific questions about the book itself. So you mentioned Stanley's collaboration with Mobius, right?
Yeah, briefly.
And,
yeah.
And I mean, I feel like that's a modern example of maybe Stanley creating a comic book. Although it's with a character that, you know, I don't think he can claim sole credit for.
The Silver Surfer, he didn't claim any credit for. I mean, he claimed credit for coming up with the name, but that's one rare character where Stan conceded that Jack had been the sole creator.
So yeah, okay, even more to the point then, you know, you still have Jack Kirby characters, the sole creation of Jack Kirby, for instance, Mr. Miracle. And with Tom King, Mr. Miracle, you know, basically swept every category, almost every category in the 2019 Eisner Awards. Where, I mean, I just want to posit this. Where's the sole creations of Stan Lee that's doing the same thing?
Right.
I mean, well, that compelling at all?
The sole creation of Stan Lee that's doing well is Stan Lee. I mean, the character of Stan Lee remains massively popular and beloved. You know, the character of Stan Lee only has a tangential relationship to the actual life of Stan Lee, but that character, as you know, presented in any number of, you know, materials, whether they're, you know, cameos in movies or even just corporate biographies, you know, that by biographies, I mean, like, you know, stuff online where you have, you know, a capsule biography of Stan Lee. Most of that stuff's not going to be accurate, or at least it'll be grossly misleading. And yet that narrative and that depiction of Stan Lee that is supposedly non-fictional has been, you know, it's enormously successful, and it's also just not really the story. So it's a bit of a sidestep to your question. To directly answer, there really
good answer, yeah.
No, well, but I mean, there aren't any, you know, non-Stan Lee creations of Stan Lee that, well, there are none, period, because he was not an artist. So every character that he ever has, you know, quote unquote sole credit for was a co-creation because he didn't draw them. But you know,
conceptualizing, I guess.
Yeah, but even the ones that he can claim to have solely conceptualized, I mean, there are very few, and they are not. I mean, the best known thing that he was associated with after he stopped doing writing stuff you know, after he stopped being directly associated with Marvel's new properties, was Stripperella, this collaboration with Pamela Anderson that was a cartoon on Spike TV in 2003. And Stripperella is not well beloved or remembered, but it got a fair amount of press because it was so outlandish that Stan Lee of all people would be making a cartoon about you know, a crime-fighting exotic dancer. But other than that, you know, I challenge you to name any characters that he came up with after his time in the trenches at Marvel. I mean, there just aren't any. None of them have stood the test of time or been really received in any kind of enthusiastic way. So yeah, that's not necessarily a diss. It's just that's how things turned out, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, it's just such a cornerstone of pop culture. You know, I feel like those characters, and then you know, his role in creating them, to whatever extent you believe. I personally kind of think Jack Kirby might have been right when he said, you know, not much. You know, Stan Lee didn't do. I mean, his contention was Stan Lee didn't do anything.
Well, his contention was that Stan definitely, that he wrote Jack never denied that Stan wrote the dialogue and the captions.
Right.
Although Jack would say that he wrote the dialogue in some ways because he would write little suggestions in the margins, but you know, he never said that he was the one who wrote the finished dialogue and narration or the credits, for example. He often pointed to the credits as something that he didn't do, but that Stan did. But when it came to creating the characters, Jack never said Stan had anything to do with any of it. Right. According to Jack, you know, Jack just came up with these characters, whether it was the Fantastic Four or the X-Men or, you know, Spider-Man, any number of these characters, and then brought them to Stan, who, you know, approved them, and it moved forward. But there was no creative contribution from Stan in Jack's version of events.
Right.
Well,
all right.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm gonna go ahead and kick over to my friend and fellow bookseller Edicson. You want to go ahead and Edicson ask your questions?
All right. Well, once again, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Please, no problem.
And just to piggyback off the talk that you guys just had, when it comes to like the ideas of like credit and creation and things of that nature, with these comic book characters and these properties now becoming these like juggernaut movie franchises that are earning GDP that you would rival small nations, why do you think it is important in this day and age to talk about like the concepts of who gets credit for the things that they create, why it's important, and why Stan Lee's story in this day and age is important to tell?
It's a great question. I mean, creator rights are, I think, essential as a part of the conversation about how entertainment and the arts work. The people who, let me put it this way, even if we accept the premise that Jack Kirby only came up with the visual representations of these characters, that's still an enormous contribution to global popular culture because of the reach that these things have now. And Jack Kirby didn't have any ownership of these characters, and he probably should have. It's just that the comics industry has been built on this concept of work for hire, where you don't really own anything that you create for Marvel or DC. It's had that's been the standard in superhero comics since time immemorial. But if we're going to try to create a more just world where people are properly remunerated for and credited for their creations, which I hope this isn't too much of a partisan thing to say, but I think that is something that should happen, that people should be fairly compensated for and credited for the things that they create, especially when they become, massively successful. If we accept that premise, then it's important to talk about credit so we can prevent, credit theft from happening in the future, and make sure that people have their material well-being looked after, or at least contributed to, if they're making a lot of money for somebody else, if their creations are making money for somebody else. I mean, the mind boggles that, Jack Kirby, and if you accept the premise that Stan co-created these characters, then Stan as well, the mind boggles that these men, or one of them, depending on how you think about it, didn't have any ownership of these characters. In virtually any other genre and medium, that idea would be completely loony, that you could come up with a bunch of characters that subsequently become the most valuable pieces of intellectual property in fiction in the world, and then you don't get anything from it. Like, you have to rely on the largesse and magnanimousness, magnanimity, I think is the word there, of the corporate overlords, who can choose to give you a lump sum of cash if they are feeling pressured, or like they want to, or that they feel like it'll help their public image. But they're under no obligation to pay you a portion of the proceeds from your creations being massive on the screens big and small, merchandise, etc. So to answer your question, I think it's important that we talk about creator credit so we can make sure that people are fairly credited for and compensated for their work, which is just not how the industry currently operates. Credit is vague, if there at all. It's often in small print at the end of a movie, and remuneration just doesn't really happen. Like, the companies will sometimes, toss a few bucks somebody's way, but because it was work for hire, they're not really under any obligation to do anything, and therefore, people whose stuff is responsible for making billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, can get nothing from those billions. It's kind of nuts.
It is quite wild indeed. And to go further along in this train of thought, as the biographer and as the researcher in this book, obviously we have the picture of you meeting Stan Lee. You have your early fandom. When you're learning about these things like the Marvel method and kind of some of the more insidious practices that Marvel did, most notably the 1977 incident with Neil Adams and the forcing of the signage of the essentially the piece of paper that said that if they didn't sign this, that they would essentially waive all their rights to work at Marvel. Does that complicate your relationship with comic books and maybe particularly your fandom, or how you view these things as a researcher?
Well, I mean, I kind of left fandom a long time ago. I mean, I hadn't read a lot of comics in many years as of about a decade ago. And then about a decade ago, I sort of got back into comics. And coming back into them, it wasn't really from a fandom perspective as it had been when I was a younger person. It was much more like, I enjoyed them, but also I started approaching them as a journalist because, I had become a professional journalist in that time. And I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to be able to start writing about this stuff professionally for a mainstream outlet, New York Magazine, and its culture site, Vulture. And I've thought about it from that perspective. So I don't think it was really that much of an issue to read about the less savory aspects of Marvel's past because, it's part of the story that I'm trying to tell. So I don't think it didn't, shatter dreams or anything, but it certainly reinforces the sense that this is an industry that has done a lot of unjust and unethical things, and where certain norms are accepted as part of the status quo when they really shouldn't be. So, yeah, I don't know. It wasn't that kind of stuff wasn't painful for me. I didn't feel like I was breaking up with something. It more just felt like I was constructing a story.
And then just as I was reading the book, there's something about the book that I didn't expect to find, and was, I think, in most parts, some of the most riveting stuff of the book, and that was Stan Lee's relationship with Judaism and his relationship with his father. And I think it's absolutely brilliant in the beginning of the book how you're laying down the setting of Stan Lee's grandfather in East Romania, and talking about the Jewish history. And so I wanted to talk to you specifically about it comes across as like there's a reluctance on Stan's part when it comes to Judaism and his relationship with it. And I thought it was oddly strange that he has these conflicts with his father, but at the same time, he allows his wife to christen their daughter JC as Christian, and some of the more kind of like vague reasons as to why he's not as involved in the Jewish community kind of dissipate when you have your wife raising your daughter in a different religion. Could you speak to that and what you learned about Stan Lee's relationship when it comes to religion?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Stan came from Jewish stock. His parents were both Jewish immigrants from refugees, really, from Eastern Romania, who arrived around the turn of the 20th century during a time of specific and very acute anti-Semitism in Romania. And Stan's parents were openly Jewish. They were not the model of. There were a lot of Jews who came to America and pretty much fully assimilated or, retained some sense of Jewish identity, but for externally and in terms of their practices really had nothing to do with it anymore. And that wasn't Stan's parents. I mean, they were not super observant, but they, according to Stan's brother, Larry Lieber, who I talked to at length, their mother still said the prayer for the dead every Friday and lit candles. Their father, Jack, born Yanku Ern, but named Jack in the United States, he, would go to services periodically, and more importantly, was just very passionate about being Jewish. Even beyond a specific religious context, he was very passionate about Jewish nationalism and Jewish identity, and celebrating being a Jew. And for whatever reason, none of that held interest for Stan, and Stan was actively pretty antipathetic to it, as you referenced. When he married his wife, who was an Episcopalian English woman, A, that was scandalous in and of itself, and B, that led to scandalous within the family, and B, that led to their daughter JC being baptized, which was something that Larry described as being very traumatic for the family, at least for Jack, the father. And I can't read Stan's mind posthumously and tell you why he distanced himself from it. My amateur theory is he just didn't really want to be associated with his own past. He wanted to create a future for himself, and that involved abandoning the family and circumstances from which he had emerged. And so his decision to walk away from Jewishness was I think part and parcel of that, or at least I suspect maybe. And it really was very pronounced. I mean, he really, something fell down. He really never talked about being Jewish, and had a lot of occasions in which it would have been natural for him to at least utter the words, "I'm Jewish," and just didn't. I mean, for example, in his autobiography, which he co-wrote with this celebrity biographer in the early 2000s, there's a point where he's talking about how he and his wife were trying to adopt a child after the death of their second child, who only lived for a few days. And they were having trouble because they were an intermarried couple. It was a mixed marriage. But the way Stan describes it is he says, we were a mixed marriage. Joan is Episcopalian, Joan being his wife, and my parents were Jewish. Not I'm Jewish, or I was Jewish. My parents were Jewish. Which is a very weird and specific way to phrase that. But when you go through his archives, and you go through his writings and so on and so forth, you find virtually no mentions of Jewishness on his part. There's like one interview from like 2005 where he says, "I think Jewish people and myself, I include myself in that, think a certain way," just as while he was making a point. But other than that, he really just never talked about it. Even when he wrote an introduction to a book about Jews in the comics industry. He wrote an introduction to a book about, that Neil Adams put together about comics about the Holocaust. And in both cases, he doesn't mention being Jewish. He might as well just be anybody writing these introductions. There's no reference to him having any kind of connection to the Jewishness of this material. And none of this is me, again, dissing. I mean, you're free to have whatever relationship you have with your upbringing, your family, religion, ethnicity, whatever. But it's just worth pointing out, because it's something that I think helps shed light on who Stan was, and on his process of sort of, creating a character for himself. And you can really learn a lot by what people choose to leave out when they kind of create a new persona for themselves. And Jewishness was very much something that Stan just didn't see fit to include in the image of Stan Lee.
And to further along this train of thought, when it comes to dysfunctional family relationships, I thought that some of the more distressing and kind of disturbing stuff in the book ultimately were like the last years of Stan's life.
Yeah.
And in particular, his relationship with his daughter, JC. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you picked this up, but I felt like I came to some sort of realization as I was reading the book. And, you can really, in regards to how, Stan as a son kind of disappointed his father in not following the passion of Judaism, and JC disappointing Stan in her reluctance or inability to become this kind of creative type artist later on in her life. Can you speak to the dysfunction of of Stan's relationship with his daughter, Jim?
Sure. I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I wonder, like, just as an addendum, like, she also never sold her art, and I think that was very important to Stan, what you could sell. Like, I feel like in the book, you do get the impression that he's a very ardent capitalist.
Sure. He was very, there was no trace of socialism in him when it came to money making. I mean, I don't think he was outside the norm necessarily, but he very much was somebody who liked to make money and more than that needed to make money in liquid cash form because of his relationship with his daughter and his wife. Both of them, by all accounts, and this is not me just picking up on gossip, it's just people will say, Stan said it, and many others did as well. His wife and his daughter had very expensive spending habits. They were both sort of shopaholics who would buy a lot of stuff, and like a lot of money on a month-to-month basis was being spent. And Stan needed to have liquid cash to keep that churn going. And so there were a lot of business decisions that he made that, if they were not entirely based on him trying to provide for his wife and daughter, they were certainly largely decided by that. When I was speaking to Larry Lieber, his brother, Larry said that they spoke in the last couple of years of Stan's life, and Stan was saying he was just exhausted with having to go to all these conventions. I mean, Stan was in his 90s at this point. It's kind of insane that he was doing these convention appearances and flying all around the world to do them. But Larry said, so why are you doing them? Why do you keep doing this if it's so exhausting? And he said, I have to because of my wife and daughter. Like they spend so much money and I have to provide for them and I don't have a choice. Because when he would do these convention appearances, he could make a lot of liquid cash very quickly because it was, cash for the appearance and for people getting signatures and photographs with him. And so, when it comes to the relationship in general with his daughter, it was very fraught. It's essential to the story, though, because it's not a sideshow of gossip, because according to a lot of people who were close to Stan, especially in his final years, day to day, he was barely thinking about any of the work he was doing. He was just thinking about his daughter. Like, his daughter was such a commitment for him, and she would get into trouble and she would have financial difficulties and she would be furious with him and just yell obscenities at him, and they would get into these really difficult situations. But Stan never separated from her. Stan never disowned her or tried to kick her out of his life. He, for whatever his reasons were, was very devoted to his wife and his daughter. And, that manifested itself in a close relationship where the closeness could really become toxic. I mean, I heard recordings made semi-surreptitiously of Stan and JC just screaming at each other, bloody murder. I mean, just awful, obscene fights that you would just never wish on your worst enemy to have fights like that with your own offspring. And so, it was very difficult. And like I said, you kind of just don't wish that on anybody, but it was essential to understanding why Stan was making the public decisions he was making. And it's essential to understanding what's going to happen to his legacy. Because, I mean, the estate of Stan Lee consists of his daughter, and his daughter had a very complicated relationship with him and with the world in general. So if you don't understand that stuff, it's hard to understand the story of Stan Lee is generally how I think about it.
And one thing that I was really impressed by in terms of like a storytelling aspect in the book, and you kind of lay the seeds of it in the beginning, and it really pays off when we get to the later chapters of Stan's life. You talk about his days at Clinton DeWitt High School, and how he's presumably the kind of alumni that are kind of roaming the halls as Stan is going through school are some pretty prestigious
big names
in the school. But the person that he kind of very vividly remembers is this kind of gregarious, kind of loud talking newspaper salesman.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how you kind of like lay down that foundation, especially when we get to the introduction of Peter Paul, his associate, and kind of who he was as a person. Could you speak to why characters like that tended to get Stan's interest and why it is that he would associate himself with some people like that?
I mean, I think, again, it's hard to psychoanalyze, but I think Stan, his admiration of that student you mentioned, John J. McKenna, is, am I getting the middle initial wrong, but McKenna, he's referred to in Stan's memoir in the context of, I want what he had, or I wanted what he had, rather. The idea was Stan was watching this fellow student whose job it was to try and sell subscriptions to the New York Times, hawking his wares in front of the class and doing well with it. And Stan looked at that and said, I want that. I want to be able to do that. And perhaps that was the same instinct that led him to then get involved with characters later on who were also sort of salesmen, whether literally salesmen or just people who could sell you on whatever idea they were trying to push toward you. Maybe it came from the same place of this idea of wanting to be a great salesman and therefore surrounding himself with people who he identified as salesmen. But also Stan was just very susceptible to flattery. And, these people later on in his life who, got him into trouble, whatever they did, and, you can debate about the specifics, his associations with these people really led to disaster. Maybe, that came from, I'm sorry, I was saying he's susceptible to flattery. So, I mean, a lot of that was also just those people saying, hey, I can make you famous and I can make you rich. I can make you even more famous and more rich than you already are. And that was, if you told that to Stan and for whatever reason he deemed you credible, you had his ear. And then if you could sell him on getting into bed with you, professionally speaking, then you were off to the races. His body man from his last few years, Jonathan Bolerjack, just told me straight up, the best way to get into Stan's inner circle was to be a bullshitter. I mean, to be able to kind of kiss ass and say that you were devoted to him and had his best interests at heart. And that could get you far. And at the same time, for Stan himself, that could really lead to some dead ends.
And so I have a couple more questions and then
sure,
we can wrap it up. I wanted to talk about the relationship with Jack Kirby. I know we spoke about it earlier on in this interview, but I kind of want to see it from Jack's perspective. It's a very fruitful relationship, obviously, especially during the Marvel years, where they're, churning out these characters. But, when you go to kind of its genesis in the late 30s, early 40s, all throughout, even after Jack died, there is just some levels of dysfunction and toxicity that I cannot for the life of me understand how, Jack could have put up with some of that, whether it be the 1941 incident where him and Joe Simon essentially get fired because the only other person that would have known about the kind of the art working that they were doing was Stan, whether it's the 1966, Herald Tribune article that's very, unflattering to Jack, and just kind of like some of these more creative decisions and consternations from Stan's part. Why would Jack kind of put up with that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, Jack, for one thing, when they were working together back in their professional days, he needed the money. I mean, it's funny. We keep coming back to that in this conversation, just the capitalist need for a steady stream of income. But that is what motivates a lot of people to do a lot of things that they might not otherwise do. And Jack kept working for Marvel because he needed the paycheck. I mean, he couldn't work for DC in the 60s because there was an outstanding legal dispute not related to DC, but with one of the editors about a separate project, one of the DC editors. And they were the only other big game in town. So, he's at Marvel churning out all these pages because he wants to provide for his family. And mind you, he's a freelancer because the comics industry is terrible to its creative laborers. I mean, he was a freelancer. They weren't providing for him beyond just sending him a freelance paycheck, a paycheck that was meager compared to what he was doing because he was co-writing all the comics, but he was only getting paid as an artist. But he put up with it because he needed that money. He needed the stability. And then eventually the path was opened at DC because the editor he had the dispute with left. So he went to DC and there found himself frustrated again. And then he went back to Marvel. They'd made a deal that was better than the DC deal, although it still wasn't a great deal. And he didn't have to work with Stan that time. So that was a little more appealing. And then later in life, they would snipe at each other in the press, but then weirdly, there are these stories of them seeing each other in person where they're perfectly polite to one another. And I don't know if that's a generational thing, maybe you just didn't show your animosity quite in the same way if you were brought up in certain circles. But, I think with Jack, from what I understand, a lot of it had to do with the fact that even though he was genuinely dissatisfied with the way he'd been treated, he was not prone to fits of fury. And, according to his assistants, he would do these interviews where he'd talk about how terrible Stan was to him and how terrible Marvel was to him. And then the minute the interview was over, it was like it didn't happen. Like he was just back to being whoever he was and wasn't incensed and didn't really emotionally hold a grudge. Intellectually, he held a grudge, but he didn't sit around stewing over it and giving himself an ulcer over it. At least that's what I'm told. I didn't know Jack. But yeah, I mean, I think to answer your question, earlier on, it was because he needed the money. And then later on, who can say? Maybe he was being polite. Maybe he felt like there wasn't any point in fighting. I don't know.
I could ask a related question.
Sure.
How self-aware do you think Stan Lee was when he would do things like I think it was in the book when they had the big celebration for him, that was kind of this and he makes the joke. He says, "Oh, you'll do the work and I'll do the credit." I want to say.
Well, there were a couple of incidents where he made jokes like that a fair amount.
Yeah, and
one was he made it once after a question I asked him at a press conference. It was the only time I ever addressed him directly in a question, was just the one question at a press conference. But he would say it elsewhere too. You do all the work, I'll do the credit, or it's great. He does all the work and I get all the credit. That kind of joke, which is kind of remarkable in retrospect because he's drawing attention to the core crime that he's been accused of, which is creative theft and labor theft and stolen glory, etc. I don't know. The human mind is a mystery. I sometimes we tell on ourselves, and I couldn't tell you whether it was subconscious or him trying to defuse the issue by turning it into humor. I don't know. He didn't talk about that much, and I didn't get to interview him. So I don't know what the exact reasoning behind making those statements was, but it's certainly remarkable.
Yeah, kind of bad.
And then lastly, this is more of like a ingest kind of question. There's an oddity in the book when you're listing the kind of the photographic credits. You discover that the Stan Lee papers are at the University of Wyoming, and first thing that comes to mind is, why does a man who has no relationship
to Wyoming? Yeah. So the University of Wyoming has a collection of archives for cultural figures in America called the American Heritage Center. And so they do outreach to try to get cultural figures to donate their papers and such. And around 1980, the then director of the American Heritage Center reached out to Stan and asked, and Stan was kind of at maybe not the lowest ebb, but excuse me, but certainly not as famous as he had once been, and definitely not as famous as he would later be. So there weren't a whole lot of people asking, as far as I know. So when the University of Wyoming comes a calling, he's willing to listen. I mean, like I said, he's very susceptible to flattery. Who wouldn't want to be interested in having their archives preserved at a university? But according to Stan, and as is true of any story that Stan says, who knows how true it is, he was initially tentative, but when they started listing people who also had their archives there, they got to Jack Benny, the great comedian and radio personality. And according to Stan, he said, well, if it's good enough for Jack Benny, it's good enough for me. So he went with the University of Wyoming, which, yeah, it's very odd on the face of it. It's just, I'm sure there are comic book fans in Wyoming, but not that many because there just aren't that many people in Wyoming. And Laramie it's pretty out of the way. It's kind of an advantage for me in this slightly perverse way because so few people have actually bothered to go to the Stanley archives that there was a lot of stuff in there that people just weren't familiar with. If his archives were at Columbia University, for example, or UCLA, whatever, you'd have a lot more digging into those archives. Maybe not, but I would suspect that more students who are just like doing a student paper, for something might want to go to the archives and peruse. But as it is, to get to Laramie, you have to fly to Denver and then take one of two flights that run every day, only two flights that run every day from Denver to the Laramie airport. And it's the same when you're trying to escape from Laramie. You have to take one of two flights back to Denver. And the flights are like way early in the morning or way late at night. And, it's just a bit of a pain. But once you get there, it's a treasure trove. And I really thank the university for being so generous, not only in letting me look through the archives and being helpful there, but also digitizing things, which now are preserved for posterity because I asked them to digitize them. And letting me use the visual materials in the book. They were very kind about allowing that to happen. So yeah, that's the story of the University of Wyoming archives. I encourage anyone who's interested in Stan to go visit, but be prepared. There's almost 200 boxes of stuff. You'll never get through all of it. I was there a week and I barely scratched the surface. I mean, I got a lot of stuff, but I didn't really get to read it while I was there because it's just piles and piles of files. I would just have my research assistant, I would flag things for my research assistant to go scan without me having even read them, just like looking for keywords and going like, okay, this looks like one that's worth having. Scan this, don't scan this, yes, no. And then I didn't start reading the stuff until I got home, basically. And same with a lot of the recordings. I watched and listened to some while I was there, but mostly I was just listening for a little bit or watching for a little bit so I could then ask them to digitize the stuff and send it to me remotely later. So anyway, that's a very long answer that you weren't looking for, but the staff there is great and the material they have is really something.
And then one last follow-up in regards to the research aspect. When you're going through the archives, whatever you were able to get through, was there anything that even as a researcher of his life kind of like stumped you or floored you or surprised you? Well,
the big thing that was surprising to me was that they donated their home movies, like VHS tapes of just literally home movies. I'm not saying it was just like on a home movie camera. It was them having Christmas Day or them just hanging out in the veranda one afternoon. Most of it's from the 80s when they had this camcorder that they would just sort of bring out for whatever reason. And then home movies shot by Peter Paul, who also was a video camera nut and gave a lot of those videos. Before they had the falling out, those videos were often copied and given to the Lees. So they had those as well. And it's amazing what's in there. And nobody had talked about any of this stuff. People have been to these archives, and I was shocked that no one had really done anything with the home movies. I've now had them digitized, so they're preserved. But they're not, there's nothing in there that's like scandalous on the face of it. It's more just, you see these private family dynamics start to play out, and it really enriches your understanding of what this story was, of who this guy was, and who the people around him were. So that was probably the biggest surprise, was finding all of the home movie VHS tapes. I really didn't see that coming.
All right, Jim, do you have any last questions?
No, I think that about covers it. Yeah, thanks for doing this with us, Abraham. Like,
hey, no problem.
I like, honestly, I think, and I've actually read more than one book about Stan Lee, and I think this was my favorite. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate
really
that.
I want to agree. I want to say thank you once again for joining us and having this taking the time to speak to us. I think this is really important scholarship.
Thank you.
I think that as we're going on in this kind of like moment of zeitgeist with the superhero film and the comic book film, I think it's important to have these stories out there to understand where we are and where we could go as a culture.
That means a lot. I thank you. My quick question: are those all actually copies of the book behind you? Or are they printouts?
No, those are all copies.
Copies, yeah.
Oh wow. Oh, so are you both at the store right now, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just in different rooms. We got 32 rooms here.
Okay. For some reason, I was
it's
assuming
a COVID precaution. We can't be next to each other.
That makes sense. Okay, I was assuming that Edison was at home, and therefore I was like, wow, it's a lot of copies to pick up for yourself. But okay, got it. Well, thank you guys so much. I'll come by and visit next time I'm in the area.
Oh, please do. Thank you.
Great.